I was standing on the stage, the crowd chanting my name, when I got their message, "You owe us 15 years of our life. Pay up." For a moment, I thought it was a joke. After all, my parents had barely called me in 15 years. Not when I was sleeping in my car, not when I begged for help starting my company, and definitely not when I was breaking my back trying to build something from nothing. But now that I had built a $45 million empire, they suddenly remembered I existed. My name is Ava Sinclair, founder and CEO of NovaCore Innovations, a tech company that started in a tiny basement with 2 old laptops and a dream. I grew up in a small, quiet town where ambition was considered arrogance, and dreams were called distractions. My parents, Robert and Elaine, were strict, controlling, and obsessed with appearances. To them, success wasn't about happiness, it was about obedience. When I turned 18, I told them I wanted to build my own business. My father laughed in my face. "You'll come crawling back when the world crushes you," he said. And my mother added coldly, "You'll regret turning your back on family." That night, I packed my bags and left home with $300 in my pocket and a storm in my heart. I didn't crawl back. I worked harder than anyone I knew. I coded through nights, pitched to investors who didn't take me seriously, and sold prototypes door to door. Every failure built another layer of armor. Every rejection fueled my fire. 15 years later, I had built NovaCore into a global brand, known for AI systems that revolutionized small business logistics. My name was on magazine covers, my face on TV, and my inbox full of partnership offers. I had made it, alone. Then came them. At first, the texts were simple, "We're proud of you, you've done so well." But pride turned into bitterness. Then bitterness turned into greed. They began calculating, line by line, every sacrifice they said they'd made while raising me. Missed vacations, birthday gifts, time spent guiding me. And then came the invoice. A literal document. Signed. Stamped. Demanding millions. They called it reimbursement for lost parental investment. As I read their words, something inside me shifted. The warmth I once felt, the small piece of me that still wanted their love, died quietly that day. They thought I was still that desperate, obedient girl. They had no idea who they were dealing with now. Because if there's one thing I've learned in business, it's that some debts are repaid in ways money can't measure. And mine was long overdue. The first warning sign came disguised as a family dinner. After 15 years of silence, my parents invited me to their home. "Just to reconnect," they said. I almost didn't go, but part of me, the naive part still craving closure, agreed. When I arrived, the house looked different. New furniture, new decor, and a strange framed photo of me on the mantel, one taken from a magazine feature. I remember thinking, they've built a shrine to a daughter they once disowned. Dinner started politely enough. My mother complimented my success, my father nodded approvingly, and for a fleeting second, it almost felt normal. Until he said, "We always knew you'd make it, Ava. You got your work ethic from me." I nearly laughed. The man who told me I was too emotional to lead was now claiming my achievements as his legacy. It didn't stop there. A week later, my accountant called, sounding confused. "Ava, did you authorize a wire transfer to Robert and Elaine Sinclair, $250,000?" My stomach dropped. I hadn't. When I confronted my parents, my mother gasped in fake outrage. "How could you accuse us of that? You think we'd steal from our own daughter?" My father slammed his fist on the table. "We raised you better than this." They played the victim perfectly, tears, guilt, manipulation. By the end of it, I was the one apologizing. But something inside me shifted that night. A whisper of mistrust began to grow louder. Soon after, strange things started happening. My company's internal emails were leaked, minor stuff at first, but enough to cause tension. Private details about my employees' salaries appeared on gossip sites. And every time something went wrong, I'd get a text from my mother, "See? This is why you need family around you. We could help manage things." It was too convenient. Too precise. The emotional toll was worse than any corporate crisis. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I'd stare at my phone, scrolling through old messages, trying to find some proof that my parents once loved me without condition. And then, one night, I received a call from my head of security. "Ms. Sinclair, someone's been accessing our building after hours using a master key. The last swipe was registered under a guest pass issued to Robert Sinclair. Should we call the police?" I froze. My father had never been inside Novacor. He didn't even know where our main office was, at least, I thought he didn't. My hands trembled as I ended the call, staring at the dark city skyline outside my window. They wanted more than money. They were after control. And for the first time in years, I was afraid betrayal doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes, it arrives in a neatly sealed envelope. It was Monday morning when my assistant dropped the thick, ivory-colored envelope onto my desk. "This came by courier," she said softly. "It's from your parents." I stared at it, a strange chill crawling up my spine. The last time I heard from them was after I confronted my father about the security breach. They'd gone silent, too silent. I opened the envelope. Inside was a legal notice. They were suing me. Not a joke. Not a misunderstanding. A full-scale lawsuit demanding $12 million, an emotional damages claim for 15 years of parental neglect and lost opportunities. My own parents were dragging me to court for raising me. My throat went dry. I read every page twice, hoping I was hallucinating. But there it was, written in the cold language of the law. Plaintiffs Robert and Elaine Sinclair claim rightful compensation for the emotional, financial, and social distress endured as a result of defendant Ava Sinclair's abandonment and failure to provide familial restitution. Familial restitution. They'd turned my childhood into a business transaction. I sank into my chair, the world spinning around me. The woman who taught me to tie my shoes, the man who once carried me on his shoulders, now treated me like a failed investment. I had built my empire from ashes, and they wanted to burn it down to claim the smoke. Within days, the media got wind of it. Headlines exploded, tech billionaire sued by her own parents. Family betrayal, parents demand millions from self-made daughter. My board panicked. Investors called. Reporters camped outside my office. My reputation, something I'd fought 15 years to build, was unraveling overnight. I called my parents, desperate for an explanation. My mother answered, her tone icy calm. "You've had your turn, Ava. Now it's ours." I couldn't speak. My father took the phone next. "You should have shared your success. We gave you life. You owe us for every birthday, every meal, every dream you ignored." That word again, oh. It echoed in my head like a curse. I hung up and stared out the window, rage and grief colliding like a storm. The woman who stood fearless before investors now felt like a child again, cornered, small, helpless. But beneath the despair, something darker began to stir. They wanted to use the system against me, to strip away my name, my company, my peace. But they had forgotten who I'd become. I didn't build Novacor to be taken apart. Not by rivals. And definitely not by the people who called themselves my family. As the lawsuit papers lay scattered across my desk, I made myself a silent promise: if they wanted a war, they were about to get one. 4 days, I couldn't leave my penthouse. I sat in silence, curtains drawn, news channels buzzing with my name like vultures circling the dying. The lawsuit had become entertainment. Talk shows dissected my family issues. Strangers debated whether I was heartless for not giving back to my parents. The world didn't see betrayal, they saw entitlement, dressed as love. I stopped answering calls. My board begged me to settle, my PR team drafted apologies, and my lawyers whispered about damage control. But none of it mattered. I had built everything, from the ground up, and now, the people who abandoned me were painting me as a villain. On the fourth night, I opened a dusty old box from my closet, the only thing I'd kept from my childhood. Inside were fragments of a past I'd buried, report cards, crayon drawings, and an old notebook. On the first page, in my teenage handwriting, were the words, "One day, I'll build something so big they'll regret ever doubting me." A tear rolled down my cheek, not from sadness, but from clarity. I hadn't built NovaCore just to succeed. I'd built it to prove them wrong. And now, they were trying to take that too. That realization was my trigger. The switch flipped. The next morning, I walked into the office. Everyone froze, some looked relieved, others terrified. I hadn't shown my face in 2 weeks, but the second I stepped into that glass-walled boardroom, I wasn't the same woman who'd collapsed under her parents' betrayal. I was sharper. Colder. Awake. "From this moment," I said, my voice steady, "we stop reacting and start fighting." My head of security slid a file across the table. "We found something," he said. Inside were surveillance reports, phone records, and one chilling detail. My parents had been in contact with Victor Kane, my former investor and bitter rival, the man I'd fired years ago for fraud. My stomach twisted. "They've been working with him?" He nodded grimly. Kane offered to fund their lawsuit and promised to help them take back what's theirs. That was it, the final betrayal. This wasn't just greed. It was revenge disguised as justice. They wanted my empire, and Kane wanted to watch me burn. But instead of breaking, I felt something else rise within me, a calm, focused rage. For years, I'd built NovaCore by surviving storms others said would destroy me. This would be no different. That night, I stood by my window, city lights glowing below, my reflection hard and unflinching. I picked up my phone, dialed my legal chief, and said just one line, "It's time they learn who they're dealing with." Then I hung up, exhaled slowly, and whispered to myself, "You wanted a fight, Mom? Dad, you've got one." Revenge isn't spontaneous. It's logistics, patience, and a deep, strategic cruelty wrapped in precision. I didn't want to humiliate them with noise. I wanted incontrovertible proof that would strip their puppet strings away and expose every dirty hand that pulled them. Step 1. Forensic accounting. I told our CFO to audit every cent that had flowed from NovaCore to the Sinclairs, and to trace any backdoor payments to Victor Kane's network. 2 days later, a neat folder arrived on my desk: payroll anomalies, shell company invoices, and a faint trail of transfers routed through a charity that didn't exist. Names, dates, wire routing codes. The kind of paperwork accountants dream of and defendants fear. Step 2. Digital footprints. My head of security and an old hacker friend, Maya, who owed me more than a few favors, began mapping phone records, email headers, and guest logs. They found meetings between my parents and Kane at a private club, encrypted message threads, and a guest pass swipe at our headquarters that matched a contractor's ID. We compiled screenshots, metadata, and a timeline. Everything lined up like an accusation in slow motion. Step 3. Allies. I needed more than internal proof, I needed credible witnesses. I coaxed an investigative reporter I'd once helped with a startup exposé, Liam, back into my orbit. He wanted a blockbuster, I wanted the truth on paper. We fed him documents in surgical drips, timed to create curiosity but not suspicion. I also quietly secured a retired judge to advise our legal team, someone whose gravitas would make our countersuit impossible to dismiss as a PR stunt. Step 4. The trap. If they believed they were already in control, the best strategy was to let them play. I arranged a faux reconciliation meeting, an olive branch staged on my terms. Invitations sent by my assistant, cameras wired into the conference room under the guise of a new security upgrade, and microphones set to capture off-record confessions. Victor Kane, thinking he'd orchestrated a soft coup from behind the curtains, accepted an invitation to mediate. He loved being in the light where he believed he could manipulate. That arrogance would be his downfall. Step 5. The exposure plan. We synchronized legal filings, press releases, and the reporter's piece. While the lawsuit they filed would proceed, our countersuit, filed the morning after the meeting, would publicly name the charity, the shell companies, and Kane's role in bribery and extortion. The narrative would flip, from a daughter who owes money to parents who colluded with a criminal to extort her company. Social media would hum. Investors would see the truth. The board would have to act. All of this required a steady poker face. I met my parents in the neutral, glassed conference room, their smiles polite, their eyes hungry. They wore confidence like armor. Victor Kane sat across from them, smug and assured, certain the last move had been his. I placed a small leather folder on the table, a meaningless prop. Inside were copies of photos, invoices, and a single line, "We're ready to settle." My voice was soft, practiced. "I don't want to destroy the family," I said. "I only want what's fair." They leaned forward, triumphant. Under the table, my lawyer's finger hovered over a sealed envelope containing the countersuit and the reporter's embargoed story, set to release the moment Ava gave the signal. I breathed once, felt the entire company and every hard-won scar of my past tighten into a point. Then I reached for the envelope. And paused, because one final, unseen variable still lurked in the room. The conference room felt like a stage. Cameras blinked red. Reporters leaned forward. My parents smiled like people who had already won. I slid the envelope across the table and let the world watch me do something they never expected. I opened it. Within seconds, the air changed. The reporter Liam stood, his voice steady as he described the paper trail, charitable donations that led to shell companies, invoices fabricated to justify parental compensation, and wire transfers funneled through Victor Kane's network. We played security footage showing my father's guest pass at our headquarters. We played intercepted messages in Victor's smug, ruthless tone arranging payouts and promising a clean takedown. We released bank records that traced every penny. The evidence was surgical, it left no room for their practiced theatrics. On live television, my mother's face drained of color. She reached for a prepared line, "We were merely," but the microphone picked up an offhand voicemail from Victor, voice cold and amused, "Tell her it's not about money. It's about taking everything she built." That was the final nail. Legal teams moved like predators. Within hours, federal investigators served subpoenas. Banks froze the Sinclair's accounts. The shell charities and nominee companies were shuttered pending forensic review. Victor Kane, who had once brayed from the safety of dark boardrooms, was arrested that afternoon for wire fraud and conspiracy. Handcuffs clicked in the corridor outside our building. His stunned face was televised across every channel. But the real theater was the courtroom. The judge read the countersuit aloud, the words heavy: extortion, conspiracy, fraud. My parents sat under the judge's gaze, defiant at first, then blinking, faltering, their denials thinned by incontrovertible ledgers and testimony. Friends they'd bribed to pose as financial advisors recanted on the stand. The courtroom transcript, when published, read like a betrayal-by-numbers manual. Nova Corps stock, which had wavered during the initial scandal, surged as investors saw the truth. The board reinstated my position with a vote that felt less like politics and more like vindication. Employees who had feared losing their jobs returned to work with eyes bright, clients called to reaffirm long-term commitments. The empire I'd built didn't crumble, it recalibrated and strengthened. Outside the courthouse, a crowd gathered. Some clutched signs of solidarity, others filmed every moment for social feeds that hummed with a new narrative, the daughter who refused to be extorted by her own blood. I walked down the courthouse steps under a late afternoon sun, each click of my heels echoing like a metronome. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. I answered none. Inside, my parents' collapse was quiet and awful. My mother's voice broke in testimony, my father's jaw slack as the reality of criminal charges and public humiliation settled like a weight. They had tried to invoice love and entitlement with legal pads, and the ledger had come due. I paused at the bottom step, feeling the city hum beneath my feet. The bitterness that once burned had cooled into something quieter, a steady, carved-out relief. Around me, the world reassembled its story, this time with me at the center, not as a villain, but as the woman who refused to be bought or bullied. Victor Kane was led away in cuffs. My parents stared down at the papers that would define their downfall. I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. I simply watched them fall, and when they did, I stood tall, unashamed, and utterly, irrevocably free. Months passed, but the echoes of that day never truly faded. The trial made headlines for weeks: parents betray billionaire daughter, revenge of the self-made woman. It became a cautionary tale in boardrooms and living rooms alike, that not every betrayal comes from enemies, sometimes it's written in your own last name. My parents lost everything. Their accounts were seized, properties auctioned, and reputations dismantled. The same neighbors who once praised their sacrifices now whispered behind their backs. When the judgment came, the courtroom was silent as the judge's words cut clean through their pride: parental love is not a business transaction. They were ordered to pay damages and face charges for fraud and conspiracy. But no sentence could equal the punishment they gave themselves: the knowledge that they'd destroyed the very thing they once claimed to love. Victor Kane? His empire collapsed overnight. Every company he touched turned to ash as investors fled. The man who once boasted he could own me was reduced to a headline about corruption and greed. He now sits behind bars, counting the years he traded for his arrogance. As for me, I rebuilt, stronger and wiser. Novacor thrived like never before. My leadership was no longer questioned, my name no longer carried scandal, only respect. The very chaos they tried to use against me became the fire that reforged my steel. But I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply worked, quietly and purposefully, knowing that the best revenge isn't destruction, it's endurance. On the anniversary of the verdict, I visited the old town where it all began. The Sinclair house stood abandoned, windows boarded, paint peeling, silence heavy in the air. I walked up to the rusted gate and left behind one thing: a framed copy of my very first paycheck, signed to the girl you said would crawl back. Then I turned, walked away, and never looked back. I had spent years chasing validation from people who couldn't see beyond their own reflection. But now I understood: freedom isn't about what you build for others. It's about what you refuse to let them take from you. As the sun set behind me, I smiled, not in triumph, but in peace. They tried to turn my success into their debt, but in the end, it was their greed that bankrupted them forever. Clapperboard, break the fourth wall. Tell me, have you ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you? How did you rise after they tried to break you? Share your story in the comments below. Backhand index pointing down. And if you believe justice always finds its way, subscribe for more stories where betrayal meets poetic revenge.